The corner where Ivy's cello had stood for 2 years was empty, and all that was left was 4 small dents in the carpet. I stood in my parents' spare room with my keys still in my hand. I had driven straight from summer camp pickup, my 8-year-old asleep in the back seat, expecting to grab her instrument before we went home. Instead, I found a bare stand and a bright rectangle where the case used to lean against the wall. My mother appeared in the doorway drying a glass. She didn't look guilty. She looked pleased. The way people look when they've solved a problem you didn't know you had. My parents had sold my daughter's cello for $98,000. But what my grandmother said 3 days later made both of them go white. And it started with a smile. My name is Dana, and I teach 3rd grade in a small town outside Dayton. For 9 years, I have done it alone on a teacher's salary in a 2-bedroom apartment where the radiator knocks all winter. It is not a big life. It is a good one. Ivy is my whole reason for the early mornings. She is 8, small for her age, with her hair always half out of its braid, and she has played the cello since she was 6. Not because I pushed her, because she heard my grandmother play once and would not let it go. I had spent the week alone while Ivy was at camp, grading nothing, sleeping badly, missing the sound of her practicing scales through the wall. When I pulled up to the camp gate that Friday, she ran to the car with a friendship bracelet on each wrist and one question ready before the door even shut. "Can I practice cello when we get home?" I told her soon. I told her we had to swing by Grandma and Grandpa's first to pick it up. She talked the whole ride about a song she'd learned to hum, tapping the rhythm on her knees. I hadn't called ahead. I never had to. The cello lived at my parents' house in the spare room. And for 2 years, that had simply been the arrangement. It had never once occurred to me that a thing could be in your family's house and still be taken from your child. I was about to learn that it could. I told her to wait in the car. I went inside to get her instrument. That was the plan. The cello lived at my parents' house for a simple reason, and her name was Ruth. My grandmother, Ruth Ellison, is 88, and she taught school music for 40 years before her hand slowed down. She lives with my parents now in the back bedroom. And every Saturday, she gave Ivy a lesson in that spare room where the light was good. My apartment was too small for a cello and a lesson and a grandmother all at once. My parents' house had the space, so that was where it stayed, leaning in its corner. And every weekend, Ruth and Ivy sat knee to knee and worked through the same slow pieces until they sang. The cello itself was old. Ruth had given it to Ivy for her 6th birthday, wrapped in a quilt because no box was big enough. "This one has a voice," she'd said. "You'll grow into it." Nobody in the family thought much about it beyond that. It was Grandma's old thing handed down to the little one. What I remember most is the case. Ruth kept a small manila envelope tucked inside the accessory pocket behind the spare strings and the block of rosin. Ivy asked her once what was in it. Ruth just smiled and said it was a secret for later. I assumed it was sheet music or a photo, the kind of thing an old woman keeps. I never opened it. It wasn't mine to open. I walked past that case 100 times and never once wondered why a grandmother would keep something folded and sealed inside a child's instrument. 2 years I walked past it. That envelope was going to matter more than the cello. I just didn't know it yet. Standing in that empty room with my keys biting into my palm, my mother is 61 and she has never once in my life admitted to being wrong. She stood in that doorway drying the same glass she'd already dried, waiting for me to catch up. "Where's Ivy's cello?" I asked. I kept my voice level. I have a lot of practice keeping my voice level around my mother. "We sold it," she said. Just like that. The way you'd say you returned a library book. I asked her to say it again because the words rearranged themselves in the air and didn't make sense. She set the glass down. "We sold the cello, Dana. Last week. A dealer came out from Columbus and gave us a very fair price. A fair price for my daughter's instrument. I felt the floor tilt a little under me. I asked how much. She said the number like it was good news, like she expected me to be relieved. $98,000. I remember thinking there had to be a mistake. That no old cello of Grandma's was worth a used car, let alone a house down payment. And underneath that, colder, was the math I couldn't stop doing. $98,000 had walked out of that house, and not $1 of it belonged to my mother to spend. Mom, I said. That wasn't yours. She smiled at me like I was a slow student. Honey, she said. Nothing in this house is only one person's. That's what family means. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, expecting me to follow, expecting the conversation to be over because she had decided it was over. I did not follow. I stood in the empty room and asked the only question that mattered next. What did you do with the money? She led me to the back door and I heard it before I saw it. An excavator. In my parents' backyard, where the tomato garden used to be, a yellow machine was clawing a wide hole out of the earth, and two men in orange vests were staking out a rectangle with string. My mother crossed her arms and looked at it the way other people look at a sunset. A pool, she said. Heated. For the grandkids. For a second, I thought she meant Ivy. Then I saw the sign leaning against the fence, the one from the pool company, and the little banner my mother had already ordered. It said Welcome to Bree's Backyard Oasis. Bree is my younger sister. Her two kids, 4 and 6, splash in a plastic tub every summer. My mother had taken the sound out of my daughter's hands and poured it into concrete for someone else's children. You sold Ivy's cello, I said slowly, to build a pool for Bree's kids? The pool is for all the grandchildren, she said, which was a lie because the banner had a name on it, and the name was not my daughter's. I asked her how she could possibly think that was fair. And my mother gave me the answer she would give me a dozen more times before this was over, the sentence I would come to hear in my sleep. She said it lightly, brushing a bug off her sleeve. It's just an old instrument, Dana. Family shares. Then she went to offer the workers lemonade. I stood at the edge of that hole and watched the machine bite another mouthful of dirt out of the ground. And I understood that no one in this house believed they had done anything wrong at all. My father Roy found me at the fence. He is 63, a big, quiet man who spent 30 years under cars, and he mistook my silence for the kind he could talk through. I know it looks fast, he said. But sitting in a corner, that thing was doing nobody any good. A cello you don't sell is just money you're scared to spend. He said it like a proverb, like something he'd worked out on long nights. My father lost his auto shop when I was in high school. Went under owing money to men he'd shaken hands with. He never got over the shame of having nothing solid to show for a working life. So he thinks in things you can stand on. A pool is a thing you can stand on. A cello to him was a coffin for cash. Dad, I said, that instrument belonged to Ivy. It belonged to the family, he said, gentle, certain. And the family needed something we could all use. He believed it. That was the part that hollowed me out. He wasn't gloating. He thought he'd been generous, turning dead weight into a summer full of splashing kids. I asked him whose name was on the sale. He shrugged. Mine and your mother's. Who else's would it be? And there it was, said out loud without a flicker of doubt. They had signed their names to sell a thing they were sure was theirs. I didn't correct him. I didn't yet know how to. I only knew, standing in that yard with the machine grinding behind me, that arguing with people this certain was like arguing with weather. You don't win by shouting at a storm. You go inside and you find the one thing the storm can't touch. That night, after Ivy was finally asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to figure out what a person can actually do. My first thought was that I had no ground to stand on. The cello had been a gift from Ruth to Ivy, given by hand, wrapped in a quilt. No receipt, no paperwork I had ever seen, a verbal gift to a child. I am not a lawyer, but I know enough to know how those disappear when someone decides to fight you. I want to be clear about something because I have watched people in these situations and thought, why didn't you do more? I did do more. Months back, when Ivy started leaving the cello there every week, I had asked my mother whether we should insure it, whether it needed papers. Marlene waved me off. It's an old cello, Dana, not a Rembrandt. I had even offered to bring it to my apartment. She said the lessons were easier at the house, that I was making a fuss. So I let it be because picking that fight seemed small next to keeping the peace. And keeping the peace is a habit I learned young in that family. I called a lawyer I knew from the school district that night just to ask. She was kind and honest. A verbal gift is nearly impossible to prove, she told me. Without documentation, you'd be spending money you didn't have to chase a claim you probably couldn't win. I thanked her and hung up and sat in the dark, feeling the walls of it close in. There was one thing I couldn't shake, though. Ruth weeks earlier, patting the case, saying, "Don't you worry about this old thing." Somebody thought ahead. I hadn't asked what she meant. I should have. The next morning, I did the one thing I was sure of. I stopped bringing Ivy to that house. It sounds small. It wasn't. Not in our family where Saturday lessons at Grandma and Grandpa's were as fixed as the sunrise. But I was not going to hand my daughter back into a place where the adults had already decided her things were theirs to sell. So I told Ivy the lessons would happen at home now, that Grandma Ruth would come to us. I called Ruth to arrange it, and she agreed before I finished the sentence, which I noticed, but didn't have room to think about yet. Then came the hard part. Ivy wanted to know where her cello was. She'd been asking since the car. I sat her down on the couch, and I did not lie to her because she is 8, not stupid, and lies to children rot the ground they stand on. I told her that Grandpa and Grandma had sold it, that it was a mistake, and that I was going to try to get it back. Her face did the thing I will never forgive them for. It crumpled slowly, the way a child's does when they're trying to be brave about something too big. But Grandma Ruth said it was mine, she whispered. She said I'd grow into it. You will, I told her. I promise you will. I didn't know if I could keep that promise. I said it anyway because sometimes you plant a flag on ground you don't own yet and then you go take the ground. That night she cried herself to sleep humming the piece she'd learned at camp. No instrument to play it on. I sat outside her door and made myself a quiet, specific promise of my own. Ruth called me 2 days later and asked me to come by while my parents were at church. That alone should have told me something. Ruth doesn't sneak, but she wanted me there without Marlene. And when I got there, she was waiting in her chair by the window with her hands folded, calm as still water. I expected her to be devastated. That cello had been in her keeping most of her life. Instead, she looked at me the way a woman looks at a chessboard when she's already seen 4 moves ahead. "Sit down, Dana," she said. "Tell me exactly what happened." So I told her. The dealer from Columbus, the 98,000, the hole in the yard with Bree's name on it. Ruth listened without interrupting, nodding slowly. And the only time her expression changed was when I mentioned the sale. "And whose names?" she asked very quietly. "Did they sign to sell it?" I told her Roy and Marlene's. "Both of them." Ruth's mouth did something small and hard to read. Not anger, something closer to satisfaction, quickly hidden. "They signed a bill of sale," she said half to herself. "That's good." "Grandma," I said. "How is any of this good?" She patted my hand. "You've been carrying this like it's already lost," she said. "It isn't. Not even close." She wouldn't say more that day. She said there was a thing she needed to find first, something she'd put away a long time ago for exactly a day like this, and that she wanted it in her own 2 hands before she said another word. I drove home more confused than when I'd come. My grandmother, who had every reason to grieve, was acting like a woman about to collect on a bet. The family did what families do. It closed ranks around the loudest, most convenient version of the truth. Bree texted me that afternoon and her message was a small masterpiece of grievance. Why was I making everything about money? Why couldn't I be happy the kids would have somewhere to swim? Did I really want to tear the family apart over a used cello? I read it twice and set the phone down because there is no reply to a person who has decided you are the villain in a story they wrote before you arrived. My aunt called next, my mother's sister, to tell me gently that a house full of little ones needed a pool more than one child needed a fancy instrument. My cousin liked a photo my mother posted of the dig site, captioned "Making Memories." One by one, the people I'd grown up with stepped over what had actually happened and landed on the comfortable side of it. I understood the pull. Bree has 2 kids and a husband who'd just been laid off from the plant. My parents are getting older and want to be the generous ones while they still can. Set next to all that, one quiet teacher and her one quiet daughter and one old cello were easy to wave away. That's how these things work. Not with a conspiracy, with a slow, warm tide of everyone agreeing not to look too hard at the thing that would cost them their comfort to see. I have never felt more alone in a family I'd spent my whole life keeping the peace for. I stopped answering the group chat. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, but it did. It always does. And Ruth still hadn't called me back with whatever she'd gone looking for. When Ruth finally called me back, she didn't talk about the cello at all. She talked about 1974. I want to tell you about a family I taught, she said, and I sat down because when Ruth starts in the past, she's usually walking you towards something in the present. She taught music in a district up north, and one of her students came from a family that owned a violin, a good one, passed down 4 generations. When the grandmother died, there was a fight. 2 brothers, 1 instrument, no paper anywhere that said who it belonged to. It went to whichever one grabbed it first and got a lawyer meanest. Ruth said. The boy who actually played it, who loved it, got nothing. I watched it happen from the second row of the funeral. She was quiet a moment. I decided then that if I ever had something worth taking, I would never leave it to a fist fight. I would leave it to the law. I asked her what she meant. She said, I mean that after your grandfather passed, I sat down with a man named Gerald Pruitt and I made some arrangements. Quiet ones, the kind you don't talk about until you need them. My skin prickled. Grandma, what arrangements? Come Saturday, she said. Bring nothing. I'll have found it by then. And she hung up the way she does, leaving me holding a question with no bottom to it. I lay awake that night turning it over. A lawyer, arrangements, a woman who'd watched one instrument tear a family in half and decided ours never would. Whatever Ruth had done, she'd done it years ago in silence and told no one, not my mother, not me. She'd been waiting, patient as winter, for someone to try exactly what my parents had just tried. My mother came to my apartment on Thursday uninvited with a foil-covered casserole like this was a normal visit. She set it on my counter and got right to it. Your father and I are worried about you, she said. You're isolating yourself over a cello. I leaned against the sink and let her talk. The dig starts Monday, she went on. We're having a little party when it's done. Everyone's coming. I want you and Ivy there. I don't want this thing. She waved her hand at the space between us to become a whole rift. This thing, I said, is you selling my daughter's instrument without asking anyone? She sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. And then she said it again, softer this time, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. It's just an old instrument, Dana. Family shares. The same line as always. Second time to my face. I could have screamed it back at her. I didn't. I have learned that the people who say family shares only ever mean sharing in one direction, from you to them, and that arguing the point just gives them a wall to lean on. So I said nothing. I put her casserole in the fridge. I thanked her for coming. She left thinking she'd made progress, that I was softening, that the peace was being kept the way it always got kept in that family, with me swallowing it. She was wrong about that. Something had changed in me that week, quietly, the way a lock turns. I wasn't swallowing anything anymore. I was waiting, the same as Ruth had waited, for the moment when the right words in the right room would land like a dropped anvil. My mother had just told me exactly where and when that room would be. Monday they broke ground. Saturday a party. I marked the calendar. Saturday, I drove to my parents' house while they were out running errands, and Ruth met me at the door before I could knock. She had her cardigan on and her good shoes, like she was going somewhere, though she wasn't. In here, she said, and led me not to the spare room, but to her own bedroom, to the closet, where an old accessory case sat on the shelf above her winter coats. Not the cello case, a separate one, hard shell, the kind you'd keep spare bows and strings in. She had me carry it down. It was heavier than it looked. Open it, she said, lowering herself into the chair by her window. My hands weren't quite steady on the latches. Inside was exactly what you'd expect at first. A spare bow, coils of string in paper sleeves, a cake of rosin gone amber with age, and underneath all of it, flat against the felt bottom, the manila envelope, the same one that had lived in the cello case for years, that Ivy had asked about, that Ruth had called a secret for later. She'd moved it weeks ago. Right after the sale. She'd quietly slipped it out and hidden it here because she'd known that if my parents had sold the instrument, they might come looking through the case next. Go on, Ruth said. It's been waiting a long time to be useful. I picked it up. It was soft with age at the corners, and it had a small weight to it. Papers folded and refold. My grandmother watched me with her hands in her lap, calm as a Sunday. Whatever was inside had been sealed and set aside for a day exactly like this one. I broke the flap open and looked in. Inside was a folded appraisal and a note in her steady hand. For Ivy and for the day someone tries to take it. I read the note 3 times before I could make myself unfold the rest. Ruth's handwriting hasn't changed in my whole life, all long loops and firm downstrokes. A school teacher's hand. Under the note was a document on heavy paper, printed and stamped and signed from a firm in Cincinnati I'd never heard of, dated the year Ivy turned 6. An appraisal, a formal one, the kind with a raised seal and a signature line and a paragraph about qualifications and standards. I skimmed it with my heart going hard, and words jumped out at me that I did not fully understand yet, but understood enough to feel the floor shift again, this time in the other direction. Maker, provenance, fair market value, and a number typed clean in the middle of the page that made the 98,000 my parents had celebrated look like a tip left on a table. I looked up at Ruth. She was smiling. That small, patient smile, the one she gets when a student finally hears the note they've been missing. You had it appraised, I said. Of course I did, she said. You don't hand a child something worth what that's worth and just hope. I had it looked at properly the same month I set it aside for her. And then I had Gerald handle the rest. The rest, I repeated. Come sit, she said. There's more in there than a price. There's a reason your parents' bill of sale is going to be the most expensive piece of paper they ever signed. I sat. I held that envelope in both hands like it might fly off. For 2 years, it had lived a foot from a cello, and no one had thought to ask what it was. Now, it was the only thing in the world that mattered, and it had been mine to find the whole time. I just had to be desperate enough to look. Ruth told me the rest slowly, the way she teaches, one line until it lands before the next. The appraisal wasn't the whole of it. It was the reason for the rest of it. When your grandfather died, I made myself a promise, she said. Anything in this family worth taking would go somewhere no one could grab it in a fight. So a long time ago, I sat down with Gerald Pruitt and I built a trust and I put this cello into it. She said the word plainly like it was a kind of box, which in a way it is. The cello has belonged to that trust for 20 years, she went on. It was never mine to give and never anyone's to take. When Ivy turned 6 and I saw how she loved it, I named her the one it's held for, and I had it appraised again so nobody could ever pretend it was junk. But the trust itself is old, older than she is. She looked at me steady. The cello doesn't belong to Ivy the way a doll belongs to a child. It belongs to the trust, and Ivy is who it's held for. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole thing. I asked her what the difference was. The difference, she said, is that a gift can be argued about. A trust is owned by the trust. It has a trustee whose only job is to protect what's in it. And that trustee is not your mother, and it is not your father. I felt something cold and clear move through me, like the first real breath after crying. So when they sold it, I said, they sold something that was never theirs to sell. Ruth finished. They sold trust property. And a person can't sell what they don't own, no matter how many names they sign. She let that sit. Outside, a car door slammed. My parents were home. Ruth folded my hand around the envelope. Not yet, she said quietly. You'll know when, but you'll want to make one phone call first, and it isn't to them. I slid the envelope into my bag and stood as my mother's voice called from the kitchen, asking who'd left the closet light on. I drove home with the envelope in my bag, and something new sitting in my chest. For a week, I had walked around feeling like a woman who'd been robbed and handed a broom to clean up the glass. Now I understood I hadn't been robbed of anything they could keep. They'd taken a cello. They had not taken the thing that decided who the cello belonged to, because that thing was a piece of paper in a trust in a lawyer's file, and it had been sitting there quietly the whole time doing exactly what Ruth built it to do. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because it wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was steadier than that. It was the feeling of finding out the ground you'd been told was quicksand is actually rock. My parents were so certain. That was their whole power. That unshakable certainty that everything in their house flowed downhill to whoever they decided needed it most. And their certainty was built on a thing that simply wasn't true. They thought they'd sold their own property. They'd sold a child's trust brokered by nobody with the right to broker it. I made a cup of tea. I didn't drink it. I sat with the appraisal open on my kitchen table for a long time, reading that number, reading the maker's name, reading Ruth's note for Ivy and for the day someone tries to take it. My grandmother had seen this day coming 20 years before it arrived and had quietly, patiently, without telling a soul, built the wall it would break against. All I had to do was stop grieving long enough to pick up the phone. So the next morning, I did. I called Gerald Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt had a voice like a slow river, unhurried, deep, the kind that makes you feel your problem is smaller than you thought. He knew who I was before I finished introducing myself. Ruth's granddaughter, he said. She told me you might call. She's been telling me that for a couple of years now, ever since she set that cello aside for the girl. He'd drawn up the trust himself 20 years back. He was the trustee. He had a copy of everything Ruth had in that envelope and more, filed and current in a drawer in Cincinnati. I told him what my parents had done. He listened, and when I was finished, he asked me the same question Ruth had asked. Do you know if they signed a bill of sale? I said yes. Both of them, to a dealer out of Columbus. Good, he said. And I was starting to understand that in this story, my parents signing their names was not the smart move they thought it was. It was a confession with a date on it. Here's where we stand, Gerald said. The cello is titled to the trust. The trust owns it. Your parents had no authority to sell it, which means we have strong grounds to have the sale set aside. The buyer bought something the seller had no right to convey. Legally, that transaction is on very thin ice. I asked what that meant in plain words. It means, he said, the aim is straightforward. The instrument comes back and someone returns $98,000. It won't happen overnight, and it may take a court order to finish it, but the person who has to make it right is not you, and it is not your daughter. It's whoever signed the paper. I gripped the edge of my table. What do you need from me? The bill of sale, the dealer's name, and a little patience, he said. And Dana, one more thing. Ruth wants to be there when it's set right. So do I. Where and when is up to you. I went to see Ruth one more time before I decided anything because I needed to understand how she could be so calm. She'd lost the instrument she loved to a granddaughter's thoughtlessness and a son-in-law's stubbornness, and she was sitting there doing the crossword in ink like it was any other Tuesday. How are you not furious? I asked her. You gave that cello a home for 60 years. She set her pen down. She looked at me with those clear eyes that have watched 3 generations of this family make the same mistakes. And she said the thing I have carried with me ever since. She smiled first. Then very softly she said, that cello wasn't what you thought. I waited. You've been mourning it like it was gone, Ruth said. But it was never really theirs to take. The minute I put it in that trust, it stopped being a thing that could be lost in a fight. It became a thing the law would always give back. Your mother thinks she sold an old cello. What she actually did was pull on a rope that's tied to a wall she can't see. She picked her pen back up. I'm not furious, she said, because I already won this fight. I won it 20 years ago at a desk in Cincinnati when everyone thought I was just an old woman being fussy about paperwork. I sat there and let it wash over me. This quiet, patient, absolutely ruthless love. My grandmother had built a trap out of a legal document and baited it with the only thing my parents couldn't resist, which was their own certainty that they could take whatever they wanted. And now they'd stepped in at both feet and signed their names to prove it. I knew exactly where I wanted the trap to close. Gerald tracked down the buyer within days. The dealer was a man named Foster who ran a stringed instrument shop off a square in Columbus, the kind of place with good light and a bell on the door. Gerald called him first, lawyer to businessmen, and then with Foster's blessing, he let me sit in on the second call. I'd been dreading it. I'd built Foster up in my mind as a co-conspirator, a man who'd known and hadn't cared. He wasn't. When Gerald explained that the cello had been sold out of a trust by people with no authority to sell it, there was a long silence on the line. And then Foster said, "You're telling me I bought a minor's trust property?" "I'm afraid so," Gerald said. Foster made a sound I can only describe as a professional in pain. He'd done everything right on his end, he told us. He'd paid fair value. He'd gotten a signed bill of sale. He'd had the instrument authenticated. What he hadn't done, because no one told him, was know that the sellers didn't own it. "I've been in this business 30 years, he said. "I do not touch stolen provenance. Send me the trust documentation. If it's what you say it is, the instrument comes back, and I want my money from whoever lied to me, not from a child." I could have hugged the man through the phone. It turned out the appraisal Ruth had commissioned matched Foster's own authentication almost line for line. Same maker, same provenance. He'd known it was a serious instrument. He just hadn't known it wasn't for sale. When we hung up, Gerald said, "That's the last piece. The buyer's on our side. Now it's just a matter of where you'd like to hand your parents the bill." I already knew. My mother found out I'd been talking to a lawyer because in a family like mine, nothing stays quiet for long. And she called me in a fury I could feel through the phone. "You hired a lawyer against your own parents," she said. "Do you have any idea how that looks? To sue us over a cello?" I told her I hadn't hired anyone. I told her the lawyer was Ruth's and had been for 20 years and that maybe she should sit down for the rest of the conversation. She didn't want the rest of the conversation. She wanted me to feel the weight of what I was doing to the family, the shame of airing this, the ingratitude of a daughter who'd take her own mother to court. "After everything we've done for you and that girl," she said, and I noticed she couldn't even say Ivy's name. "This is how you repay us." I didn't take the bait. I have taken the bait my whole life. Apologized for things I didn't do to keep a peace that only ever cost me. Not this time. "Mom," I said calm as I could manage. "I'll see you Saturday at the party." That threw her. She'd expected me to fold or to fight, and instead I'd agreed to come to her celebration, and she couldn't figure out why. She recovered enough to say she was glad I was being reasonable, and I let her think that's what it was. In the background of the call, I heard my father say something low, and my mother snapped at him. And for the first time, I heard a crack in the certainty. Roy, at least, had started to wonder. My mother hadn't. My mother was going to walk into her own party absolutely sure she'd already won. The invitation came in the mail 2 days later, an actual printed card because my mother does nothing by half. Please join us to celebrate Bree's backyard oasis. A cartoon son wearing sunglasses, the date, the time, swimsuits encouraged. She had invited the whole extended family, the neighbors on both sides, and Pastor Dwyer from the church because my mother's proudest moments are the public ones, the ones with an audience to admire her generosity. I sat with that card at my kitchen table for a long while. I could have handled all of this privately. Gerald offered to. A letter, a phone call, the whole thing resolved in the quiet of a lawyer's office where no one would be embarrassed. And I thought about it. I really did because I am not a cruel person and I don't enjoy a scene. But then I thought about Ivy on the couch whispering that Grandma said it was hers. I thought about my mother saying family shares to my face twice, so sure she'd never be made to answer for it. I thought about every relative who'd stepped over the truth to keep their comfort. And I decided that the truth that had been handled quietly for 20 years had earned the right to be said out loud. Once in the room where they'd all agreed not to look at it. So I called Gerald and I told him yes, bring the file. Come to the party. I called Ruth and told her the same. And she said, I'll wear my blue dress. I arranged for Ivy to spend that afternoon with her best friend's family, safe and far from it, because she'd been hurt enough and didn't need to watch the grown-ups sort it out. Then I marked the day and waited for Saturday. They mailed invitations to celebrate a pool built with my daughter's cello. I RSVP'd yes. What I brought to that party wasn't a gift. Bree came to see me the night before the party, which I did not expect. She stood in my doorway looking smaller than I remembered, her eyes already red. I didn't know it was worth that much, she said. I swear I didn't. Mom just said it was Grandma's old cello and that the family had decided. The family had decided. I heard under the words how it had gone. My mother deciding and calling it the family the way she always had, and Bree tired and broke and used to being the one they took care of. Not asking a single question because the answer was going her way. Marcus lost his job in March, she said. We're 3 months behind on everything. When Mom said the kids could have a pool, I wanted them to have one good summer. I didn't think about whose it was. For a moment, I felt for her. I really did. She wasn't the mastermind. She was a woman drowning who'd grabbed the first thing floating past and never checked whose it was. That's the near sympathy of it. But then I asked her the only question that mattered. Bree, now that you know it's Ivy's, and now that you know what it's worth, are you telling Mom to stop the pool and give it back? And she looked at the floor and she didn't answer. And that was my answer. Because being sorry and being sorry enough to give something back are 2 different countries, and my sister lives in the first one. I didn't hate her for it. I just stopped expecting her to save me. Get some sleep, I told her. And I closed the door gently, and I understood that tomorrow I would be doing this without a single ally in that yard who shared my blood, except one old woman in a blue dress. Gerald came to my apartment Saturday morning, 2 hours before the party, to go over everything one last time. He spread it across my kitchen table like a man laying out tools. The trust document, thick and formal. Ruth's signature on the last page from 20 years back. The appraisal with its raised seal. A certified copy of the bill of sale my parents had signed, which Gerald had obtained through Foster. Their 2 names in blue ink under a line that said seller. And Ruth's handwritten note, which wasn't legally necessary, but which I asked to bring anyway, because some truths deserve to be in a person's own hand. You understand how this goes, Gerald said. I don't shout. I don't accuse. I state what the documents say and I let them speak. The law is quiet, Dana. That's its whole advantage. People who are wrong get loud. People who are right can afford to whisper. I told him I understood. I'd spent my whole life being the quiet one, mistaking it for weakness. He was telling me it had been a weapon the whole time if I'd only known how to hold it. Ruth arrived in her blue dress with her hair set. And Gerald offered her his arm, and the three of us drove out toward my parents' house in the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full, the way the air feels before a storm you're actually ready for. I had a folder on my lap. In it was every piece of paper that turned my mother's certainty into a mistake with a price tag. I wasn't nervous, which surprised me. I was clear. I looked out the window at the ordinary summer streets and thought about a bare stand in a spare room, for small dents in a carpet, and a child humming a song with no instrument to play it on. The party was in full swing when we pulled up. Cars lined both sides of the street. From the backyard came the sound of it, the pool pump humming, kids shrieking, the clatter of ice in plastic cups, a country song on somebody's speaker. My mother had strung up lights and a banner. Welcome to Bree's Backyard Oasis. And the pool itself sat there gleaming blue and new. The water so clean it looked like glass. I walked in through the side gate with the folder under my arm. And for a moment, nobody noticed me. Then heads started to turn because behind me came Ruth in her blue dress on the arm of a tall stranger in a suit that did not belong at a pool party. My mother crossed the yard, smiling, arms open, playing hostess to the hilt. Dana, you made it. And you brought Grandma, how lovely. She didn't ask who Gerald was. She was too busy being generous in public. She turned to her guests and raised her glass. We are so blessed, she announced, to be able to give these grandbabies a summer they'll never forget, because that's what family does. Family shares. Third time. In front of 40 people. The neighbors, the pastor, my aunt, my cousins, Bree hovering at the edge with a paper plate she wasn't eating from. My mother said family shares to a yard full of witnesses and beamed like a woman who'd never once been asked to prove it. I set my drink down on the picnic table. I looked at Ruth and she gave me the smallest nod. I looked at Gerald and he opened the flap of his leather bag. And I stepped forward and I asked in a voice pitched to carry just far enough if I could say a few words before everyone got in the water. The yard quieted the way yards do when someone's about to make a toast. My mother's face lit up because she thought I was going to bless the pool. Thought her difficult daughter had finally come around to be reasonable in public where it counted. Of course, honey, she said. Everyone, my daughter Dana wants to say a few words. 40 faces turned toward me. The pump hummed. A kid did a cannonball and nobody laughed because the air had already changed, though only Ruth and I knew why. I kept my voice low and steady the way Gerald had told me the law speaks. Thank you all for coming, I said. I know how much this pool means to my mother. She's told me herself more than once. Family shares. I let that hang. My mother nodded, pleased. So I think it's only fair, I went on, that the whole family understands exactly what was shared to pay for it. That's when I gestured and Gerald Pruitt stepped up beside me and set his leather bag on the picnic table, and my mother's smile began very slowly to curdle. Who is that? She said. Mom, I said gently. This is Gerald Pruitt. He's an attorney. He's Grandma Ruth's attorney, and he has been for 20 years. The yard was dead silent now. Even the kids in the shallow end had gone still, sensing it the way children do. Pastor Dwyer set down his lemonade. My aunt's hand drifted to her chest. And my mother, who had spent a week and a lifetime certain that everything in her house flowed to whoever she chose, looked at the stranger unzipping a folder on her picnic table and for the first time I could remember did not know what was about to happen to her. Dana, she said, and her voice had lost its music. Whatever this is not the place. It's exactly the place, I said. You picked it. You sent the invitations. And I nodded to Gerald and he began. Gerald laid the papers out one at a time, and he did it slowly so everyone could see. This, he said in that unhurried river voice, is a trust established by Ruth Ellison 20 years ago. Inside it is one item, a cello. It has been the property of this trust that entire time. 2 years ago it was set aside to be held for the benefit of one child, Ivy Carver. He set down the next page. This is an appraisal of that cello commissioned 2 years ago when it was designated for her. He didn't read the number out loud. He didn't have to. Anyone standing close enough to see it made a sound, a soft intake of breath that moved through the yard like wind through wheat. And this, Gerald said, laying down the last page, and his voice never rose a single degree, is a bill of sale, signed 3 weeks ago by Roy and Marlene Carver, selling that cello for $98,000 to a dealer in Columbus. Neither of them is the trustee. Neither of them had any authority to sell it. They sold a child's property that was never at any point theirs to sell. I stepped forward then and I kept my voice as low as his. You didn't sell an old instrument, I said to my mother. You sold something that legally belonged to my daughter. That cello was never yours to share. My mother went white. And then exactly the way Ruth said the wrong people do, she got loud. This is a setup, she shouted, and her voice cracked down the middle. You did this to your own family, in my house, at my party. You ungrateful, spiteful, Roy, say something. But my father wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his own name in blue ink on the bill of sale, and the color had drained clean out of his face, and he wasn't saying anything at all. 40 people stood in absolute silence around a bright blue pool, while my mother screamed and my father turned to stone, and I stood in the middle of it, perfectly calm, holding nothing but the truth. Gerald let my mother's shouting run out. The way you let a kettle finish screaming before you take it off the heat. When she'd gone silent, breathing hard, he spoke to the whole yard as much as to her. Here is what happens now, he said. The sale is almost certainly void, and I'd expect a court to say so without much trouble. A person cannot convey property they do not own. The buyer, Mr. Foster, has already agreed to return the cello because he's an honest man who was deceived. And the $98,000 he paid must be returned to him. Not by Ivy, not by Dana, by the 2 people who signed this document. He tapped the bill of sale once. If that money is not returned, the trust will pursue it in court, and the signed bill of sale you're looking at will be the first exhibit we put in front of a judge. My father made a sound then, low, like something giving way. $98,000 they didn't have, because most of it was sitting in the hole behind us wearing a coat of fresh concrete. Roy sat down heavily on the edge of a lawn chair, white as the paper on the table, staring at the pool he'd built out of a thing he never owned. My mother turned to the guests, wild now, looking for someone to agree with her. She's tearing this family apart, she said, over a cello. And Pastor Dwyer, who had known my mother for 30 years, said quietly, Marlene, she's a little girl. It was her cello. Nobody defended my mother after that. The neighbors looked at their shoes. My aunt set down her plate. The tide that had rolled so warmly in Bree's direction all week went out all at once in front of everyone and left my parents standing alone in the shallow end of their own party. I could have left it there. It would have been enough. But I'd promised myself sitting outside Ivy's door that first night that if I ever got the chance, I would say the whole thing out loud once so it could never be rewritten. So I turned to the yard, to all those familiar faces, and I said what I'd come to say. I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, I told them, and I meant it. I'm doing it because a child asked me where her cello went and the honest answer was that the people who were supposed to protect it sold it out from under her. That instrument and everything it's worth belongs to Ivy. It's in a trust. No one at this table gets to decide otherwise, no matter how much they need a pool. Not my mother, not my father, not me. I looked at my mother when I said the last part because I wanted her to hear that I wasn't taking it for myself either. This was never about family sharing, I said. You can't share what you take. Those aren't the same thing, and I think everyone here has always known the difference. My mother had no answer. For the first time in my life, she had no answer at all. Bree was crying quietly by the fence, and this time I let her, because some tears are the beginning of a person finally seeing clearly, and that wasn't mine to interrupt. Gerald gathered his papers back into their folder without a word. Ruth stood by the gate in her blue dress, small and straight, watching her granddaughter say the thing she'd built 20 years of paperwork to make sayable. And when I was done, I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to argue. I walked back to Ruth and offered her my arm. We went out through the side gate the way we'd come, past the cars, past the banner with my sister's name on it, and behind us the party did not resume. There was no music now, no shrieking kids, just the pump humming over a pool nobody was swimming in. Water so clean it still looked like glass. I didn't stay to watch them absorb it. I didn't need to. Some victories you savor and some you just walk away from clean. And this was the second kind. Gerald held the car door for Ruth and she settled in with a small satisfied sigh. And as I came around to the other side, I caught my father through the fence, still sitting in that lawn chair, still white, staring at the hole in the ground that had cost him everything he had and then some. He looked up and found me through the slats. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. But something passed between us, and I think it was the first honest thing to pass between us in years, which was simply that we both finally understood what he had done. I got in the car. Gerald pulled away from the curb. In the back seat, Ruth reached forward and squeezed my shoulder with her thin, strong fingers, and she didn't say a word, and she didn't have to. Behind us, my mother's oasis sat empty in the afternoon sun, waiting for a summer that wasn't going to come the way she'd planned. The cello came home 11 days later. Foster drove it out himself, refused gas money, and carried the case up my apartment stairs like it was made of glass, which in a way it was. When Ivy saw it, she didn't shriek or jump. She went very still, the way she does when something matters, and then she knelt down and unlatched the case with careful hands, and just looked at it for a long moment before she touched a single string. My parents returned the money. Not easily. They took a second mortgage to do it, because the concrete in the yard couldn't be poured back into a check, and the half-finished pool sat there through the fall, fenced off, collecting leaves, until they had it filled back in with dirt the following spring. The garden never came back. The relatives who'd liked the dig site photos got very quiet, and a few of them, to their credit, called me later to say they were sorry that they hadn't understood. Bree and I are careful with each other now, which is more honest than what we had before. That Saturday afternoon, in my small apartment with the knocking radiator, Ruth sat in the armchair by the window and Ivy tuned the cello slowly, string by string, the way her great-grandmother had taught her. Then she played the piece she'd learned at camp, the one she'd only ever been able to hum. Ruth closed her eyes. I stood in the doorway and let myself finally cry. I see my parents now, but on my terms, which is a sentence I never imagined I'd be able to say. Holidays in public places, short visits. Ivy sees Ruth every week at our apartment where the cello stays and where no one has ever once suggested that it belongs to anyone but her. I keep a copy of the trust document in a fireproof box in my closet now, right where I can find it, because Ruth taught me that love you can't back up is just hope. My mother said family shares to me 3 times. And she was right about one thing and wrong about everything else. Families do share. They share Saturdays and casseroles and the good light in a spare room where a child learns to play. What they don't get to do is call it sharing when they simply take and then hand you the bill for objecting. I know the difference now. I made sure my mother knows it, too. And the next time someone in that family decides what my daughter gets to keep, they'll find out the same way my parents did. That quiet people who plan ahead are the hardest ones in the world to rob. That cello wasn't what they thought. And neither was I. Because real protection is quiet. It's the paper you file years before anyone believes they can take what your child loves. That's how a quiet teacher got her daughter's cello back. An empty carpet. 4 dents in the rug. A manila envelope. A lawyer at a pool party. If someone in your family has ever decided what your child gets to keep, protect it in writing before they do. Share this with the quiet one who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge, where the people they underestimated always get the last word.